Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this session for our series of events this week on terrorism and social media. This session will be on the far right and COVID, two topics which on their own are causing a considerable degree of concern, but put them together and we have some very serious but also very interesting security problems to consider. My name's Andrew Glazzard. I'm a visiting associate professor at Swansea University, the Cyber Threats Research Centre, and I'm a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute for Peace, and I'll be chairing today's session, which will be with 5 panelists, but 3 short papers, short sessions. First will be an examination of Australian violent extremism in the context of COVID-19, featuring Dr. Julian, Droogan and Lise Waldek from Macquarie University in Australia. Julian is a senior lecturer in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology, and also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Policing, Intelligence and Counterterrorism, and Lisa is a lecturer in the same department. Then we'll be moving on to polarization and the pandemic with my colleague Dr. Lella Nouri from the Cyber Threats Research Centre at Swansea, and Dr. Suraj Lakhani, who's a lecturer at the School of Law, Politics and Sociology at the University of Sussex. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Daniela Pisoiu, who is a senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, who will be talking about effects of the pandemic on the far right in Germany and Austria. So just a couple of very minor points of housekeeping. And for those of you attending, you will see, you should, that the session is being recorded. And throughout the papers, please do feel free to raise any questions in the Q&A session. So we will hear from our presenters for about 30 minutes in total, and then we'll have 30 minutes for question and answers. So please feel free to put your questions in as you hear the speakers talk, but also there'll obviously be an opportunity to raise your questions in the 30 minutes of discussion we'll have in the second half of this session. So let me move to our first paper and to Julian and Lise. And the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this really interesting panel and to be part of the wider online TASM conference. We did come to England a couple of years ago, and it's a great opportunity to do this online. So today we want to talk about a piece of work that we're currently engaged in at the moment. So we don't have any concrete findings at the moment, but like some of the presentations yesterday, it talks to the work that we've been funded by the New South Wales government here in Australia to do. And it looks at Australian violent extremism in the context of the pandemic that we're all living through. So although the current piece of work we're not at the actual analysis stage, it does emerge, and it has emerged from a previous piece of work, which you can actually see. The publication is at the bottom of this slide. And this was again funded by the New South Wales government to effectively examine online right-wing extremism in Australia and in New South Wales. And this was a joint piece of work with the Victoria University as well. And this piece of work was a multi-platform, multi-method study. We worked with our data scientist, Dr. Brian Balson-Stanton, and we scraped data from the sites that you can see on the slide. So we borrowed data from Scrippens and Ryan from Facebook, but we actually took our own data from Gab. And this was taken from both the pre and post Mastodon period. We collected data from Twitter and from Reddit, 4chan and 8chan. We also partnered with Moonshot CVE Limited to carry out a 10-week analysis of right-wing extremist words on Google searches in New South Wales. And you can see that the findings of this were published at the report down below. And this new study on right-wing extremism and COVID really emerges from the critical findings that we made in that first report.
Absolutely. And so I'll say that this current project that we're engaged in at the moment really emerges from two of the key points from this previous work that Lise is talking about. And the main point really is our identification of a creeping threat to liberal democracy in Australia from this online far-right milieu. And this creeping threat we saw as characterised by narratives that challenged Australian liberal democracy through very exclusivist appeals to race and ethnicity, as well as gender. It's a very highly social space with users expressing belief through appeals to critical thinking, a rejection of political correctness, the posing of alternative conspiracy theories, and this is pre-COVID, and the use of humour and satire that is designed to shock and offend, so-called shitposting and so on. These narratives created a growing enabling environment across a range of platforms that were widening the Overton window, or that window of what's considered to be politically acceptable to discuss in terms of topics, and there was undermining the legitimacy of parliamentary democracy and also multiculturalism in Australia. And this, of course, is a process that we've seen to some degree accelerated during the current COVID-19 pandemic.
So, as we've all experienced, COVID has impacted on our lives around the world in truly unprecedented ways. And as Julian's just talked to, it has created potential risk because of that creeping threat and that opportunism that is within the right-wing extremist milieu. And so as part of this new project, we explored current research on conspiracy theories more generally and COVID. And this allowed us to kind of show that currently people are obviously scared. People feel disempowered, there's been unemployment, people feel alone, they're looking for social company. Importantly, they're looking for answers, they're looking to explain what is happening to them. And also, obviously, anecdotally, people are online more because of school closures, digital learning and working from home. And this means that there are plenty of opportunities for right-wing extremist communities to essentially use COVID-19 for engagement and recruitment.
And so what we're doing in this project is we're taking our previous data sample and then we're comparing that with a new data sample we're going to talk about in a moment, taken from YouTube and Twitter. And we're doing research that's really asking three hypotheses, deductive research. We're looking at three hypotheses to see how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the online far-right milieu across a series of platforms. And that first hypothesis really is that the volume and spread of right-wing extremist terms and narratives on Australian social media has increased over the last 2 years in a statistically significant way. We're really looking for an increase in right-wing extremist terminology across both Twitter and YouTube comments. Our second hypothesis is that moderation is working, we think, at least on Twitter platform perhaps. Our previous research demonstrated a decreasing rate of right-wing extremist content on Twitter, indicating that moderation was successful, at least in the Australian context. But we're really going to see how this success has continued in the context of COVID. And our third hypothesis is looking at how extensively far-right extremist themes and narratives are gaining traction outside of these extremist online environments during COVID-19. And so what we're expecting to see here is a result of COVID and conspiracy narratives, right-wing extremist terms and narratives to have spread out of these nasty sort of, quote unquote echo chambers on Gab and on Facebook and into the wider online social discourse in Australia, in particular through our analysis of YouTube comments.
So essentially, what is our new data? Well, I think it's important to say that in our previous project, what we did was we turned over the stone and looked at horrible environments online, particularly Gab. Now we can't actually collect on Gab anymore because their terms and conditions have changed, and that would contravene our ethics agreement. And we did write to Gab and ask for permission, but obviously they haven't responded. So essentially what we wanted to do was create a kind of insight into what Australians, mainstream Australians, were engaging online. So rather than looking at those nasty bits. So we have two key sources of data. We have purchased 1% of Australian tweets over a 2-year period. This 2-year period covers the US riots, Capitol riots, COVID-19 and the elections. And it, as I said, it provides us with a sample of mainstream Australian Twitter activity. We use the one-track historical power track method to purchase the data. And so as a consequence, what we've got is around 4 million tweets. These are from accounts that identify as Australian. However, we've also upped our data by looking at non-Australian tweets and quote tweets from our sample population. And that means that we've got about 6 million tweets to kind of investigate. And we note that a retweet isn't an endorsement, but it does show engagement and create visibility within our Australian audience on Twitter.
Now, our other form of data is taken from YouTube, in particular YouTube comments. Here we're trying to look at the spread or leakage of far-right extremist narratives into the wider online Australian communities. We're looking at 21 Australian YouTube channels. We can't be certain that the people commenting are always Australian, but we can certainly be certain that these channels are created by Australians, generally for Australian audiences. The channels that we've selected really represent broad categories of topic areas on YouTube. We've also added a section of channels that we consider to be the sort of general alt-right, in particular alt-right youth culture. You can see them on the screen. The selections was considered really on the basis of popularity of the channels, also the basis of the number of followers and the volume of content that was produced on these channels. And so they're some of the largest, most dynamic and vibrant Australian YouTube channels. Several of the ones that we hope to include, such as our national broadcasters news, the ABC News, and also some of our Murdoch-owned press channels, we weren't able to look at because they had their comments turned off. And also some of the more well-known right-wing extremist influencers or micro-celebrities that we wanted to look at had their either channels suspended or their comments turned off prior to us being able to gather the data. At the moment, we have a little over 13 million comments downloaded from YouTube. We don't have, obviously, account location information, but we know, as I said before, that they're Australian channels.
And so what are our methods? So one of our key methods is to use a word list that we created for our previous project. But we've updated that in light of COVID and also, obviously, the very dynamic online right-wing extremist milieu. Currently, it contains around about 1,200 words, and these reflect the spectrum extremist terminology. So actually, it's moved beyond just right-wing extremism. We've put in authoritarian left extremism, religious extremism, Hinduism, Sikhism, related Islamist conspiracy theories, COVID-specific conspiracy theories, general politics, and words associated with actual extremist actions. And essentially, this resource offers us an opportunity to explore and test these hypotheses. And so along with our data scientist, Dr. Brian Baltham-Stanton, we're also working with a statistician here at Macquarie University. And that means we're able to draw on good statistically supported inferences from our data. And that's actually one of the really exciting elements of this. Because essentially it is a hypothesis testing study. The previous one was a hypothesis generating study. And what we want to look at is the frequency of what we've called the nasty words over time to try and falsify what we think in what we said in those hypotheses and Julian talked to you before. And so this is really where we're at the moment. We've got all of our data, we've got our word list, and now we're working very closely with the statistician and Brian to actually generate the findings that we can then analyse.
And that is where we'll end the presentation, but we're really hoping to be over in Wales sometime in the near future to see you all and to be able to report on the findings of this research. Also looking forward to the questions as the panel goes forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you both. Very interesting and very tantalising. As clearly we're at the stage of your project where we're about to find out, I'm sure, some really interesting things about the spread of right-wing extremism in Australia, and a very clear presentation of your methods. Let's move on to our second presentation, and Lella and Suraj. Please, you are now in the chair.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Perfect. Great, so my name is Suraj and I'm here with my colleague Lella from Swansea University. And today we're going to be talking about our research, polarisation and the pandemic. Before I go into introducing the research, I just want to give a quick nod to our project team who are from a number of different institutions. So we're all fully aware that COVID-19 has had a detrimental effect across the globe on people's health, the economy, social situations. And there's been particular concern with the far right's use of COVID-19 to spread misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, both about the virus itself and government's responses to it, particularly on social media. And it could be argued that this has led to further polarization within societies globally. Although this polarization has arguably existed for a number of years across European states on issues around immigration, the economy, health, justice, etc., we can argue that it has been particularly accentuated by the recent pandemic. So our research examines these considerations using Twitter data collected from Germany's far-right populist party, political party Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, and its users as a case study. AfD are Germany's largest opposition party, or at least they were last time we checked very recently. And I won't go into the history of AfD here, but you can read all about them in a paper we're preparing for publication. But what I will say is that of late, AfD has struggled to maintain their popularity and influence, and at least part of this appears to be due to the initial failure of the party to capitalize on the pandemic. Initially, AfD expressed their support for the German government when they introduced lockdown measures in March 2022, and they even criticized Angela Merkel for not doing enough to restrict the spread of COVID-19. When it became apparent they were losing popularity, however, their response changed and they focused their attention on espousing anti-government rhetoric, opposing lockdown measures, and questioning the validity of PCR tests and face coverings and vaccines. So how does this relate to and overlap with wider research on COVID-19 misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories? Well, as expected of a relatively new and unknown phenomenon, work on COVID-19 and conspiracy theories is particularly scant. The literature that does exist discusses COVID-19 as almost an ideal opportunity for malevolent actors to exploit. And this is through the spread of misinformation and disinformation online, as I've mentioned before. As COVID-19 moved towards pandemic status and numerous countries globally started to enforce lockdown measures, there was a proliferation in online spaces, including major online platforms, social media platforms, of conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation, often finding their way into mainstream discourse. So regarding this, there are often widespread claims, that 5G technology was the cause of the illness rather than the pandemic. Bill Gates created the pandemic in order to capitalize on a lucrative vaccination program, etc., etc. We've all heard the conspiracy theories numerous times by now. This is not something that's new. Apparently, during the emergence of the Russian flu, people were blaming it on the recent emergence of the electric light. So these conspiracy theories aren't a new phenomenon. However, kind of when you bring this all together, one aspect that appears to be generally agreed upon within the literature is this kind of anti-government, anti-establishment sentiment, which is connected to the pandemic. And this is something that we found true within our own research as well. So our research contributes to the emerging field on the effects and the response of COVID-19 pandemic from those on the far right. And although misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories are without doubt the underpinnings of much of these sentiments, this research particularly focuses upon anti-government and anti-establishment narratives within the wider framework of polarization. And prior to discussing our findings, I'll briefly outline the methodology we used for this work. I think it's really important to state that this is a short exploratory study, and data was collected between 11th of January 2021 and 4th of February 2021. It was collected and analysed during this time. Essentially, after a process of cleaning and processing the data, we ended up with about 2.5 million tweets. We then filtered these down with particular COVID-related keywords, which yielded a subset of data of about 48,500 COVID-related tweets, 48,661 to be precise. When looking at the topic modelling in the context of COVID-19 and related keywords, this data set yielded 5 topics, which you can see in the table on the slide at the bottom. So anti-German government, anti-global establishment, pro-government, pro-German government, and pro-global establishment, and another category. Lella's going to be talking about those in a moment. As you can also see from the slide, this was determined from a sample of about 5% of the subset of 48,661 tweets I mentioned a moment ago, resulting in around 2,400 tweets we qualitatively analysed. We then sought to extrapolate more meaning from the data set, and here we undertook a thematic analysis of a new subset of tweets. And again, I won't go into what themes emerged within the data, because I believe Lella's going to cover that, and this is a good place to hand over to her to provide a brief overview of the findings.
Great, thanks, Suraj. If we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So as Suraj has alluded to, our analysis sort of proceeded in 2 stages. And that first stage of our analysis related to identifying the polarized groups within the data set. And that was our first and most significant finding, I think, that the 2 key groups that were polarized were the German government and the global establishment. And these groups could easily, I guess, be referred to as outgroups, but I think they're most adequately explained by adopting Berger's 2021 terminology of the ineligible in-group. So unlike some of the other sectors of society that far-right groups denigrate, such as immigrants or Muslims, the German government and global establishment are assigned to an outgroup by AFD due to their prioritization of groups such as immigrants, etc. And in our case, because of their mishandling of the pandemic. So for AFD, the German government and the global establishment need therefore to be challenged for their approach to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Our second finding was that this polarization was performed through a COVID-19 thematic framing. And what you can see on the screen there is the themes, the main themes that we could see throughout that. And these themes were quite varied, but of most importance were those which spread conspiracy theories, disinformation, and misinformation, and related to the outgroup's handling of the pandemic, or the ineligible in-group. And that's themes 1 to 6 there on the slide. We haven't got that much time in this presentation, but what I wanted to do now is to give you a little bit more detail regarding this and show you some examples in order to illuminate our qualitative findings a little bit further. So this graph, thank you. This graph shows the distribution of themes as present in each main outgroup category. And what it shows, and hopefully you can see that, but it does look a little bit smaller on my screen, it shows that AFD and its followers use themes related to COVID-19 to ignite discussion, latching them to their existing ideological views, or in the case of the outgroups, to the performance of othering. COVID-19, therefore, served as a small story, that is, short narratives, through the telling of which AFD positioned themselves in the discourse and performed that othering that we've been talking about. And as you can see from the graph, in the tweets pertaining to anti-German government, those related to anti-COVID measures were most dominant. And these tweets positioned the German government as deliberately imposing unnecessary or dangerous, in some cases, measures on the in-group, so the German population. So for AfD and its followers, the German government has failed at protecting them and their values. Next slide, please. And these are some of the examples of the tweets within that category. And hopefully what you can see is that this sentiment clearly positions the government as at blame for its actions during COVID-19, not only for the spread of the virus itself, but also regarding the kind of restrictions we've all got used to. Once again, demonstrating the varied position regarding whether COVID-19 is real or poses a threat. And this relates to a lot of the early work around conspiracy theories that we talk about in our paper. Additionally, as most of us know, in terms of social uncertainty, in times of social uncertainty, people tend to look for someone to blame. And for COVID-19, AfD and its followers, they clearly position the German government. So they create that marker for blame. So not only is COVID-19 a fake virus, but the government are also using it to infringe on civil liberties. Next slide, please. The second most salient theme within the anti-German government category was related to COVID dictatorship. And this served to further polarize the German government. So if we look at that second tweet on the screen there, there's a reference to Sophie Scholl, who was a member of the anti-Nazi movement, the White Rose, and she was executed because of her anti-government activities. This is a very historically emotive example in German history, and in fact, as you can see, it's really effective. It provides a comparison point to which AfD positions themselves as the innocent campaigners against a ruthless dictatorship. Next slide, please. For the anti-establishment category, conspiracy theories and anti-COVID measures were most significant in terms of the COVID-19 themes. Through the nature of these kind of tweets, AfD and its followers discuss COVID-19 within the context of an anti-global establishment rhetoric. Through these conspiracies, AfD position themselves as the naysayers against a backdrop of deceit to the German population. Next slide, please. And as the table that I showed briefly at the beginning showed, dissenting voices were also evident in the data set. And I think this is actually really important because these dissenting voices came from a very much pro-German government and pro-global establishment rhetoric. So they were very much a direct conversation with the anti-government and anti-global establishment themes that we've just discussed. So within the pro-global establishment category, similarly, anti-COVID denial and anti-COVID conspiracy were most prevalent. And in some ways, I think these dissenting voices are just as important as the negative positioning of the German government and global establishment. These voices serve to reinforce how the ineligible in-group neglect AfD's priorities and cannot be convinced otherwise, as they have become disillusioned by the out-group. Next slide, please. Beyond the main out-groups within this data set, which of course was our main findings, which I've gone through very quickly, I just wanted to point out that data also emerged which were categorized as other. And these represented a much broader set of data that fell outside of the main out-groups. But when we looked at these tweets a little bit more closely, what we found was that the same themes that were identified within the out-group categories were also present. Most prominently, those ones related to themes 1 to 6, so the COVID denial, COVID conspiracies, etc. And what these seemed to do were to further normalize this discourse and create a word we hate, but a mood music for the polarization seen throughout this categorization. And there's some examples there on the screen. So I'm going to move quite quickly now to my final slide, just to sum up a little bit. And of course, as Suraj alluded to in the methodology, our research represents quite a small scale qualitative investigation. But what our findings do demonstrate is that the global pandemic has significantly impacted on the discourses salient within the tweets of AfD as our case study. Most notably, COVID-19 has been a key frame from which AfD and its followers have communicated their messages and disseminated their propaganda. More specifically, our data has shown that COVID-19 has been an effective tool from which groups further polarize out-groups and those ineligible to be part of the in-group. So in terms of takeaways, we might want to consider how COVID-19 has further normalized the far-right rhetoric. AfD originally lost credibility, as Suraj mentioned, amongst their followers by backing lockdown measures. The sentiment in this data goes some way to repair that loss in popularity. However, future elections, I guess, will determine whether or not this has had the desired effect. Nevertheless, arguably, all of this lends itself to widening a potential recruitment pool for AFD beyond those that would normally engage with its content. So I'm going to end there and say thank you very much, and look forward to questions after the next presentation. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Lella, and thanks, Suraj. Really interesting stuff. I've got a couple of questions that have already occurred to me, which I'm looking forward to asking you. But before we get to that, really keen to hear from Daniela, your paper, and I'm sure you'll be adding lots of perspective to far-right narratives in Germany and Austria. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I don't have a presentation. However, what I'm saying here is based largely on a growing material from Telegram on the far right. So if anyone is interested in particular issues, just contact me. I can send you over material. What I'm going to present here is, first of all, a more general analysis of why I think that the pandemic has given the far right yet another boost. And then I will present some illustrations, in particular from the area of the so-called new right in Austria and Germany, but also other parts of the far right scene. I'm not talking about the AfD. AfD is not officially extremist in Germany. However, parts of it are already under observation. I should say at this point that according to the newest German intelligence report that came out very recently, there is an increase in the far right spectrum, both in numbers and in the number of violent incidents. Authorities are especially worried about the fact that 40% of the individuals pertaining to this spectrum are considered potentially violent. Another interesting feature is that the new right, which used to be more marginal to this area, seems to have risen to the strongest and most worrisome force in the far right spectrum. So I'm quoting this from an article that is based on this report. And this is certainly due, amongst others, to their skillful instrumentalization of the pandemic and their framing of the state response. So turning now to the general analysis, there are two central inherent features of the far right which explain its resilience and indeed the expansionist in recent years, to which I will come in a second. Before, I want to also mention two external features which equally contribute to the expansion of the far right. One is the mainstreaming of the far right, meaning the taking over of far right topics in mainstream political discourse. In relation to the pandemic, we see the externalization of the threat. See, for example, by now the infamous statement of the Austrian Chancellor, according to which the virus doesn't come by plane, but by car from the Balkans. Another feature is a spillover of ideologies and conspiracy theories from the United States. Here, most prominently, the QAnon movement. There is a flourishing online scene in both countries, so both Austria and Germany. We see QAnon symbols at demonstrations, and a number of influencers, as well as a famous musician, support online the QAnon theses, such as the ones relating to children. Coming back briefly to the inherent features I just mentioned before, one is that in spite of the apparent diversity within the far right spectrum and over time, the far right has not changed its core message, which is the alleged existential threat to the us by an external them. There are variations in terms such as the change from race to culture, the so-called ethno-pluralism that we have now with the identitarians, from Jews to Muslims, from an overt anti-Semitism to an overt embrace of the state of Israel, for example, in some parts. Its constancy in itself is a political capital, as it shows stability and reliability, and it ensures a certain amount of core faithful supporters. The message furthermore capitalizes on a basic human psychological feature, which is group belonging and polarization towards other groups. This reaction gets activated particularly in moments of crisis, such as this one, real or imagined, when simple explanations with attribution of blame regularly take the shape of demonizing the other. The second feature is the capacity to redefine and rebrand new topics and issues to fit the main central narrative. We have seen this with the migration crisis, with the Great Replacement narrative, the Fortress Europe narrative. The global coalition set out to manipulate the population in accepting the destructive measures, basically migration, mass migration to replace the German, respectively the Austrian people. Now we have the Great Reset narrative. This is an initiative of the World Economic Forum to cooperate in order to manage the consequences of COVID. This has been translated into a plan of global elites for the world after the pandemic to destroy the current economic order. Here also we have things like abandonment of private property, but also the canceling of peoples and cultures, of democracy, of self-determination through the help of migration, redistribution, and of course the virus. So this global coalition is set out to manipulate the population in accepting their destructive measures. The virus itself and the vaccine have a role. One of the conspiracy theories is, for example, that the government is planning to vaccinate people at demonstrations through mosquitoes and thus to enslave them. Another type of adaptation relates to the adaptation of other foreign or ideologically different theories. For example, analysts talk now about a merger between the QAnon movement in Germany and the so-called Reichsbürger in Germany. This group does not recognize the legitimacy of the German state. And the result of the merger of those two ideologies is to say that while Germany continues to be occupied by allied forces, Trump, who is fighting the deep state, will also liberate Germany from the occupation. Maybe two reasons why this merger could happen so easily is because obviously Reichsbürger are anti-establishment, they don't recognize the state, they're against the state, against the establishment, but also because one of the recurring topics in the far right and here as well is pedophilia and fighting pedophiles. So they regularly accuse their enemies of being pedophiles. So this children topic basically was another bridge. Something else that has been adopted is the accelerationism. And also here we see ideas of provoking a revolution, basically speeding up this destructive process I mentioned before in order to basically reach the so-called tag X when the system will be overturned. Another kind of adaptation is taking over left-wing topics, such as, for example, animal rights or resistance against capitalism and corporations. And one example now in this context is, for example, the pharmaceutical industry. So basically, theories about that and how we should resist against that. Some other adaptations, it was mentioned before, but perhaps just really quickly, the whole phenomenon of COVID demonstrations and of course the online activity related to it. There are very many types of people that participate in this, also left-wing and esoterics and so forth, but they managed to basically influence and occupy this phenomenon by basically tuning it to right-wing topics. Another example is the so-called Querdenker movement. This is a movement that was initialized in Germany, in Stuttgart, mostly online, but also through demonstrations. And it was initially just a purely anti-COVID measures movement, but now is turning right-wing extremist. Just two more things before I give you really quickly empirical examples. Something that they have been also doing, continue to do also in this context is, for example, instrumentalizing science and pseudoscience. So obviously conspiracy theories are not scientific, but they're presented as being scientific, and that basically gives them credibility. So whenever we see on Telegram, for example, arguments about the vaccine, for example, there's always some kind of pseudo-scientific evidence. Another thing is by quoting people who are credible, so doctors or all sorts of, or for example, priests. And another thing is the fact that, you know, in spite of all these differences within the scene, the far right essentially holds together. So, for example, QAnon supports the AfD. You know, we could see that in some of the material. Now, really quickly to give you a few examples of things that we've seen. As I say, it's Telegram material in the German-speaking world, in particular identitarians, but also other far-right actors and of course QAnon. They framed their opposition to COVID measures actually as protecting democracy. I see here some parallels to what we heard before, protecting constitution, human rights, claiming that what the government is trying to do is establishing a global dictatorship after the model of China, for example. There's also theories about total surveillance on the population. The accelerationism that I mentioned before, there is the argument of saying that the societal collapse is unavoidable and the sooner it happens, the better. So for example, identitarians are theorizing about whether they should help the Greens get elected in order to help the things getting, getting some speed. Yeah, another thing that they mention is, for example, double standards, that elites are actually not following the measures, but all these measures are actually just for the regular people. The elites are staying in luxury apartments, they're not wearing masks, they're not being vaccinated, and so forth. Another thing is there was also the idea of creating the preconditions for a civil war. Early in the year, it's not clear if this idea is still continuing to be influential. What else? Oh yeah, so for example, attacking the establishment, this anti-establishment thing, attacking the credibility, saying that the government is lying about numbers, about deaths, about the numbers of beds in hospital and so forth. They're purposefully sowing panic in the population. That's what basically the argument is. Some of the QAnon themes, just random examples. For example, that the vaccine code is actually the number of the beast, that the Freemasons are about to take over the world, that people are being genetically manipulated through the vaccine, that the vaccine contains poison, and that there are corona organ traffickers, that the mask is actually a sign of enslavement, and so forth. So I don't want to take more time, but yeah, if anyone is interested in particular issues or material, just let me know. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Daniela. You got a huge amount of material in a very short presentation there. That was fascinating, and again, I'm sure there'll be lots of things to come back to you on. For our audience out there, if you want to ask any questions, then please do so through the Q&A function. Just type a question into the box, and hopefully we'll have time to answer it. Well, I thought I would take the privilege of sharing this and ask the first question, which was prompted by Lella and Suraj's paper, but I think applies to all three papers, which is a question about the extent to which we can talk about the extreme or the far right or extreme right wing as a kind of extremist movement, when a theme in different ways of all three of your papers was mainstreaming. So Julian and Lise, you talked about the Overton window, what is moving what is acceptable in political discourse. But if it's acceptable, then by definition it's kind of not extreme. If we're talking about mainstreaming, extremist ideas and techniques, then once they become mainstream, again by definition, that they're no longer extreme. And I thought it came up for me particularly clearly out of Lella and Suraj's paper, because you're talking about what you started off by introducing as Germany's largest opposition party. So to what extent can we really, let's take the AfD as an example. To what extent, can we be sort of, can we rely on concepts like extreme when we're talking about something with, a political movement which has so much support? Does that cause us a problem, in our conceptualization of extremism?
Shall I go first? Yeah, absolutely right, Andrew. It's a really good question and a really good observation. And for me and for others like Aurelian Mondon and Aaron Winter, actually, the normalization and mainstreaming of far-right rhetoric and ideologies into mainstream discourse is one of the biggest challenges we're going to be facing for a very, very long time. And I completely get the argument about when something becomes mainstream, then is it still extreme? And that's an academic debate we need to have. But at the same time, what we've seen increasingly frequently is that the normalization and mainstreaming of far-right rhetoric into political discourse, into media rhetoric or whatever it is, does result often enough in increased Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, hate crime. So there is that theoretical argument. However, there is the kind of also we need to keep an eye on kind of what's happening on the ground as well. I think the AFD kind of encapsulates that quite well. So when the AFD was established, it was by no means considered to be a populist party. It focused on particular issues that weren't really about immigration or other things we might consider to be populist within kind of current definitions. However, it kind of it moved towards that position as kind of time went on, and you can see that in numerous pieces of research. Actually, Daniela wrote a paper with Reem Ahmed, which talks about that quite well. And although AFD are Germany's, and Daniela can correct me, I think they still are Germany's largest opposition party, actually they are currently under surveillance from Germany's Federal Office for the Protection of Constitution. There was a particular wing of AFD that was under surveillance, but actually of March 2020, surveillance was extended to the entire party. And I think the words they used, loosely translated, were that the AFD, well, there was a suspicion of the AFD posing a threat to democracy. So I think, yeah, absolutely, Andrew, you're right, and it's a good question, and it's a very, very messy area, but kind of reiterating, I made the point at the beginning, the normalization and mainstreaming of far-right rhetoric and ideologies into mainstream discourse is one of the biggest challenges I think we'll be facing for a good number of years. Lella, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I'll let Daniela's got her hand up, and Julian, Lisa, I'll let them go ahead.
Yeah, please go ahead, Daniela.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just wanted to say quickly something about the mainstreaming. So, because the idea was, well, if there's already a mainstream, like, why is it, how do we use the extreme then, label in this case? And I think, well, the movement is actually very strong. And the problem is that what you have is basically you have government of right-wing type, so conservative parties who have adopted some of these themes. In some countries, you have conservative party plus right-wing extremist party. And this is basically a very massive movement. It's very worrisome. At the same time, it must be also said that there is a resistance to this. So it's already a good sign that there are forces who have recognized this as a problem, because it wasn't obvious at the very beginning. It's actually a problem, and there is resistance both in intellectual circles and civil society to basically point out these things. So whenever, for example, whenever there's a tweet coming from that side, again externalizing things, there's a reply from others. So at least, so it's a struggle at the moment, and we don't know who's going to win. The other thing I wanted to mention is because there were some issues about what is far right and alt right and stuff. So thank you for mentioning the article. In that article, we also we're giving a couple of definitions, but basically, essentially, so far right is as we use it is like a umbrella term for various manifestations. So basically for the populist right, which would be the AfD, for neo-Nazis, which would be, for example, autonomous nationalists and others, and the identitarians, who are the new right. So we call them the new right in Europe, but they obviously are very similar to the alt-right in the US. And there's various theories as to who is influencing who and so forth. But there are some common features, such as, for example, this ethno-pluralism, anti-feminism, and so forth. Yeah, I'll stop there for now. But I've seen some questions, so maybe I can get a chance to reply.
Thanks, Daniela. Julian and/or Lise.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question. It's something we think about a lot. We draw a lot from, like, as others have said, from Jay and Burge's work on extremism and that distinction between the othering, and when that othering becomes focused on the outgroup's demise, essentially. And that is problematic, even if that's your mainstream. One of the things that we have seen in our previous research is, or one of the things we tried to do in our previous research, is raise awareness of the agenda of right-wing extremists to appropriate the language of the conservative right, and to speak to the conservative right and make them aware of that, with regards that many people on the conservative right are deeply passionate about democracy. And actually what the appropriation and mainstreaming does is undermine democracy, and that those conservative right individuals are at risk just as much as me being a nice Jewish woman is at risk. And so I think that is where, as much as those communities sit next to each other, that violently extreme, that extreme and that everybody else, it's those tricky edges that we as researchers, I think, are interested in and need to be clear about what's actually going over in there and what impact it's having.
Yeah, and if we've talked to political stakeholders about our research, it's been a discussion really about communicating to ministers and others that they do not like you. They don't like democracy at all. They might be using the language of conservative politics, but they are fundamentally revolutionary in that they're rejecting the fundamentals of Australian democracy. And that's where we have to take a normative perspective on liberal democracy and multiculturalism and open society. And, we've used analogies like cricket, a very Australian analogy with politicians, saying that, you have two sides of government and certainly they play hard to win the game, but both broadly agree on the rules of the game. We're lucky in Australia, we have a broadly homogenous political system like that, and they agree. And saying to people on the right, these guys want to destroy the wickets and the stumps and break up the bats and destroy the game. They are not your friends. And if you try to pander to that base, it will eventually eat you. It has worked in our discussions in Australia.
Brilliant, thank you. We have had a couple of questions about definitions and concepts. Alt-right, new right. What are you defining as far right? But I thought I would take a different question actually, because this I think gets to the heart of what the panel is grappling with, which is: do you think that the pandemic will have a lasting impact on right-wing rhetoric in the future? I think let's say extreme right-wing rhetoric in the future. Do you think it will change the way that extreme right-wing groups promote themselves and their message? So who would like to take that? Daniela, you've got your hand up. So whether that's a legacy hand or a new hand, I'll perhaps go to you first.
Yeah, thank you. So I think for them, this has been a huge opportunity to reach out to a huge pool of people that were unreachable thus far. So if you look alone at the demonstrations, but also the broader conspiracy theories. So these are people who were before not even in the right-wing spectrum or not even politically interested. So this is definitely something that they will continue to capitalize on. If I may, I just wanted to make two very short points. This idea of the far right being anti-democratic, the narrative that they promote is that they are democratic, but they reduce democracy to elections and basically reaching out to a majority of people or being supported by a majority of people. What they of course completely ignore is human rights. So this is the element of democracy that they obviously do not concur with, things like human dignity and so forth. And about the AfD, I just checked the newest report. So two branches of the AfD are now under observation, along with other parties. This is obviously not the only party. There are also other parties who are not populist, but again already declared as extremist. So Germany is a very broad and diverse scene to research on the far right.
Thanks very much. Lella, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just thanks, Andrew. Just to go back to your question about whether this will have a long-lasting effect, and I think the answer is definitely yes. I think that this has, as Daniela said, widened their pool of recruits. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that what the far right, or all of these different groups that we're looking at, have done here is nothing different to what they normally do. They've latched onto something that is very significant within the public sphere. It's just that this is a lot bigger and has more of a global impact. We talked a little bit about it in relation to small stories, and I think it definitely is that. We've seen it with all sorts of different things. We see it with immigration. We see it on a smaller scale regionally as well. And I think we don't want to overplay that either. So yes, this has changed and has definitely allowed them to reach a bigger pool of recruits, but what they're doing is not necessarily that different. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
And Julian and Lisa?
I think we were really going to back up the excellent point that was just made by Lella, which is the more things change, the more they stay the same. Absolutely, COVID will have huge effects in narratives in the short term, but go back to the 20th century and look at the last 100 years or 150 years of far-right discourse. They will latch on to any world event or local event to spread their narratives. And no matter how much it changes, their narratives are broadly the same. Secret Jewish cabals and so on. It's just, the old gifts in new packages.
And I think I talked to the point you made before, the question you had before. And I think having that nuance and it stems to the complexity around what is actually violent extremism and what is hate and really horrible hate. And so that's kind of why we're doing this research, to say that we know that there's an online right-wing extremist milieu that's appropriating this, but exactly which elements are being appropriated by mainstream media. Like previously, obviously, we saw a lot of it because we looked for it. But if you think about like which bits of that right-wing extremist narrative, which elements are having resonance in the community, and why are they then having resonance? Is it because of right-wing extremism per se, or is it because of other things? I think it's a little bit like we've been talking about this between like people who are part of the anti-vax community and people who are vax hesitant, and trying to see some of those nuances as well. And I think it's important, as Lella's already said, about having that caveat around right-wing extremism being a strong force.
Thank you. And Suraj?
Thank you. Yeah, just to build on what other people are saying, since the pandemic, lots of people have been spending time at home and spending time online as well. So there's more opportunities afforded as well there. I think there's a kind of lot of concern about what the kind of lasting effects are going to be. We're still, I think, at the very early stages, and those will become kind of apparent as time goes on. I think there are wider things to consider as well. So without a doubt, the pandemic will have an effect on global economy, and we've seen in the past traditionally often kind of tanking economies and issues around kind of economic issues have kind of been linked to a rise in far right kind of ideologies or movements or populist parties. And also there's kind of, as a few people have been saying, that there are kind of overlaps between far right conspiracies, such as kind of globalization, the kind of secret Jewish cabal, as Julian pointed out, immigration, dictatorships, and COVID conspiracy theories. And I don't think that's kind of been any different as Lella said, over the last, across history as well. And we see that overlap, not just in recent literature. So I think Bettina Rottweiler and Paul Gill released a paper which talked about the overlaps between different far-right conspiracies, but even back to kind of Jamie Bartlett's paper and Carl Miller's paper back in 2010, where they talked about the wide-ranging overlaps of conspiracy theories. So I think, I think the short answer is yes, and I think it will have a lasting effect.
Great, thank you very much, Suraj. Daniela, you have a hand up again. Is that a legacy hand, or?
No. I wanted to make a short point because I definitely agree with the other speakers that the strategies are not new. However, I think it's new in terms of effect is the way this has been able to affect the legitimacy and credibility of the state. And I think this is a different thing and has really some important effects, because so people who join this are not necessarily because they have extreme right attitudes, but because they don't trust the state in how it has managed the pandemic. And this might actually have a serious effects in the long run. So for example, just like a short example, we have in Austria here a hotline for people to call when they have concerns about extremism and such. And they say that now by far the most dominant thing that they get is basically people calling, complaining about other people in the same family. So where the mom says usually, and it happens actually with older people. So extremism usually is something for younger people, but here we see older people who say, you know, if you get a vaccine, you're not my daughter anymore. Yeah, so these are really like stuff happening in society, which is not necessarily typically right-wing, but is an effect of what has happened through the right-wing manipulation of the pandemic situation. Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, fascinating. And clearly, this is a topic we could talk about a lot more, but we're now out of time. But it's also a topic that is going to be very dynamic, and the research that you're all doing is going to provide, you know, considerable illumination. But I think this is going to be a very fast-moving area of study. But we haven't covered every question that we had in the chat, so apologies to those who asked a question and felt that we didn't get round to talking about it. Apologies for that. But you will have chance later on today to ask us a different panel about some of the things which we have touched on in today's session. So at 8 o'clock British Summer Time, we'll be looking at exploring societal resilience to online polarization. So some of the topics we've just been talking about there will be we'll get a different airing in a different panel later today. But thank you very much to all our panelists. I can hear the virtual applause. And thank you to participants for your questions and for your attention. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you very much.